Great, I think we'll get started and people can sort of join us as they do. Eliza, do you want to get started?
Yeah, absolutely. Just letting everyone know that this webinar is being recorded, and if you don't feel comfortable that you don't want your image to be on the recording, please feel free to stop your video or let us know, let the facilitators know at any time. For those that are here for the first time, welcome. We are the Ontario Council for International Cooperation, or OCIC, and we are a growing community of organizations, institutions, and individuals working towards sustainable development. And the facilitators that you will see today are our amazing youth policymakers who are, are from all walks of life, very diverse background, and we're all here to discuss this very interesting topic on basic income. So I will pass the beacon to our facilitators.
Great, thank you, Eliza. So hi everyone, welcome to the third session of the Youth Policy Hub's four-part series on basic income. If you joined us last week, welcome back. And if you're here for the first time, we really appreciate you being here. My name is Johanna, and myself and the Youth Policy Hub are really excited to have you for the next 90 minutes. Before we get started, we do want to provide you with a land acknowledgement. We want to take a moment to reflect on the land that we live and work on, and on which both the OCIC and the Youth Policy Hub operate. What has become known as the City of Toronto resides on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. This territory is covered by the Toronto Purchase of 1787, 1805 indenture, and most recently the 2010 settlement. We encourage you to investigate which treaties, if any, apply to where you are tuning in from today, and take some time to reflect on your relationship to such treaties and how they may affect the context of the geography in which you live, work, and play. You can go to the next slide there. I want to take a minute to recognize the wonderfully talented team who made this series possible. Sarah, Arjuri, Christina, Eric, and Safa. I also want to mention that all of the members of the Youth Policy Hub have an asterisk in front of their names on the list of participants that should be on the right side of your screen. So you can easily find them and send them a message if you have any difficulties throughout the session that we can support you with. Just some housekeeping items for today. As Eliza said earlier, today's session is being recorded, so if you're not comfortable with having your face in the recording at all, feel free to turn off your camera if that's more comfortable. And if any questions come up for you while our panelists are speaking, you can put them in the chat box. And we will circle back to those during our Q&A portion of the session. We also ask that you keep all comments in the chat respectful. We're all coming together today with different levels of experience and engagement with the subject matter. And we'll move on to what you can expect today. We are fortunate to have 5 very brilliant panelists with us, each of whom I will introduce and ask to share some opening remarks. They will share some ideas about basic income in Canada from their unique perspectives based on their work lens and lived experiences. And after all panelists have shared their thoughts, we will have our Q&A period followed by a conversation cafe, which everyone will be put into smaller groups for, and the BI project team will facilitate discussions around the themes and learnings of today's webinar. That will be sort of after the hour mark, so if you're able to join us for that, that's great, and if not, no worries at all there. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panelist. Thank you. DFay Blaney. Faye is a Homolka woman of the Coast Salish Nation, and she's deeply committed to issues affecting Indigenous women. As an educator and activist, she has devoted her heart and knowledge to educating and mobilizing Canadians to better understand the impacts of colonization, capitalism, and patriarchy on First Nations women. As a founding member of the Aboriginal Women's Action Network, her passion extended into both the national and international arenas. Faye, we're so grateful to have you with us today. I'm going to invite you to now share any opening remarks that you might have.
Sure. So I have about 5 minutes, right?
That's right, yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned that I'm with the Aboriginal Women's Action Network. So I work with Indigenous women, was quite involved with the national inquiry as one of the parties withstanding. And I'm currently living on my reserve up in Campbell River right now. And I just wanted to start off by saying that what we're experiencing with the COVID-19 very much reminds me of what happened during the common experience payment dollars that flooded into the community from the residential school settlement agreement. There was a huge influx of dollars in the community, and we were going to funeral after funeral after funeral. And that's what's happening now with the COVID-19. There's additional money coming into the community, and there have been a lot of deaths relating to abuse of substances and addictions. So that's the concern that I have around basic income or guaranteed livable income. But when I look at it through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals, there is some room for optimism. I think that the levels of poverty that we experience, the health crisis that's ongoing, the inequalities in education that have carried on, throughout history, from the residential school days to the time when the Indian Act was changed and we began to enter into the public school system. We still have not had quality education, and we're denied access to education. So if there's some attention to that, I would be very happy to support basic income. And of course, women's equality is a huge concern of mine. And what I thought about was the concept of the individual versus the collective rights as we have in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the guaranteed livable income is excellent as far as it goes with individual rights. But I think that more attention needs to be paid to our collective rights as well, especially around Indigenous rights and around women's rights. And I think that those areas require a lot of attention. When I think about what goes on reserve, there's a sorely inadequate and disjointed system that operates, in which the funding is there's no continuity, there's no consistency, and programming is so broken up, and it doesn't allow for any effective healing to take place because of the way the federal government controls so much of what happens to us. And on the other front, with regard to women, I really have concerns on the way both federal and provincial governments have decimated any kind of support for women's centers, women's programming, that sort of thing. It looks like my 5 minutes is almost up already. I just wanted to finish off by saying that a big part of my work is to abolish prostitution. And I see so many of my sisters, my cousins, my relatives, as a result of poverty and addictions and sexism and patriarchy, are ending up in the streets of the downtown east side of Vancouver and other urban areas. And I really supported the Nordic model. And one of the elements of the Nordic model was implemented with the law, the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. but it didn't do a whole lot in terms of the other aspects of the Nordic model or the equality model, which is to support women to exit, to provide detox on demand, to have women-only treatment facilities for addictions, and especially for exiting services by and for women in prostitution. And in the Nordic model, they also devoted a lot of time and energy and attention to women's equality, and that certainly isn't happening in this country. So anyway, I think I've used up my time already.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Faye. I think those are really thought-provoking points. I think we'll get some really great questions from our participants from that, so thank you. Our next panelist is Chloe Halpenny. Chloe is a feminist, researcher, volunteer, and storyteller committed to a more equitable world. As a researcher with the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation, she leverages research and evaluation to inform evidence-based social policy and programming. After spending a year interviewing participants in the Ontario Basic Income Pilot for her master's research, she now serves as the Vice Chair of the Basic Income Canada Youth Network and sits on the Basic Income Task Force for Senator Mary Lou McPhedran's Youth Advisory, advocating for a basic income on behalf of youth across Canada. Chloe holds a Master of Philosophy and Gender Studies from the University of Cambridge, a Master of Science in Social Policy and Development from the London School of Economics, and a Bachelor of Public Affairs and Policy Management from Carleton University. She lives, works, and plays on unceded Algonquin land, colonially known as Ottawa. Chloe, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to invite you to share your opening remarks.
Awesome, thank you so much, Joanna. I think Eric has got my slides up. Awesome. So I will be quick because I am not good at keeping to time. So thanks so much for having me. As Joanna mentioned, my name is Chloe. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling in from unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory in Ottawa. And here to talk a little bit about that intersection of basic income and youth. So on to the next slide, please. And I'll start quickly before I kind of get into that with sort of, as a young person, I'm 24 years old, how I got into the basic income space. And really, as mentioned in my bio, it came in really around the cancellation of the Ontario Basic Income Pilot. Right before I was starting a Master's of Gender Studies, the cancellation was announced by the incoming Conservative government in Ontario, and I was angry about it and rejigged my entire thesis proposal to end up doing my project speaking with over 25 participants in the pilot about what their experiences receiving a basic income were. If I wasn't a supporter of basic income before, I ended up being a supporter of it afterwards because it was frankly impossible not to be after hearing sort of time and time again how a basic income had really changed people's lives. And we've got a photo here of one of the participants in the pilot and also in Jesse Gollum's Humans of Basic Income photo project, which I highly recommend you check out if you haven't seen it already. But onwards, next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll skim through somewhat quickly what sort of the youth case for basic income is in a couple words. So really, in short, our belief is that a basic income would provide stability for young people to plan for and invest in their futures with less fear and uncertainty, and really open up what the possibility of choices are for young people that aren't necessarily there without a basic income. So education is a big part of that. What a basic income would do to allow learners to enter and remain in education without the financial stress of really horrific student debt, which we see happening in Canada. And we've seen evidence from basic income pilots around the basic income being tied to increased enrollment and attendance and graduation rates. The idea of young people being disproportionately concentrated in precarious work, whether that's gig work or part-time or low paid, whatever that might be, and a basic income's role in sort of breaking that really well-established tie between the paid labor market and being able to feed yourself and pay your bills. And along those lines, sort of what a basic income might mean in terms of income security for a lot of the really important work that not just young people do, everybody does it, but I think a lot of young people are engaging in sort of creative work, starting a business, volunteering, engaging in activism, caregiving, but work that's not paid for, and what a basic income might mean for folks engaging in that work. Next slide, please. couple other points. A basic income, we know that marginalization in general, but particularly in the labor market, that's for certain groups of youth face. Youth is not a homogenous group. And we know that Indigenous, racialized, disabled, queer, and trans youth, as well as youth aging out of care, are often in particularly vulnerable situations in the labor market, and sort of what a basic income might mean in terms of providing security for those folks. Linking into climate justice and how a basic income might sort of break that relationship or reimagine the relationship between paid labor and consumption. And then finally, the dreaded millennial, but I imagine also Gen Z housing crisis, and what a basic income might mean in terms of providing a foothold into housing and rental markets for young people. Next slide. Alongside with that, there's a really clear case for youth activism in the basic income movement. And really simply, young people accounted for over a quarter of Canada's population in 2019. We've got voting power. We know that we hear about youth being apathetic. I have problems with that statement, but we know that young people have the power and passion and energy to bring about change. And we also have recent public opinion research in Canada that shows that young people are more likely to support basic income than their older counterparts. But despite this, we don't see a ton of young people engaging in basic income activism in Canada. So next slide. Is kind of where I guess not my pitch, but a couple months ago, myself and a couple of other young folks came together to establish, under the Basic Income Canada Network, the Basic Income Canada Youth Network, which is a group of engaged young people, and we define young as under 35, who are passionate about a basic income and mobilizing young people to advocate for and celebrate the benefits of a basic income through community building, education, and activism. It's been a busy couple of months since a basic income is on a lot of people's minds right now. We've worked on and submitted a letter to the Prime Minister, getting signatures from youth and youth organizations across the country, been working on sort of youth one-pagers and materials, and lots more to come, and working in partnership with lots of other organizations and basic income groups across the country. Next slide, please. So quick pitch, if this is something that might be interesting to you, and I'll stick around for the conversation cafe if people want to chat about this more. There's a link to sign up for our mailing list where you can become a member and sort of hear about what we're up to. There's lots coming on the horizon, including a youth activism handbook, which isn't yet out, but will be shortly. And you can also connect with us on social media through Basic Income Canada Network's channels, which they've kindly allowed us to use. And that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chloe. Yeah, I'm just going to ask everyone, if they're not speaking, to put themselves on mute, please, just so we don't get any interference. Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's really inspiring to sort of see youth engagement on basic income to that level. I think that might get some really important questions around the gig economy and precarious work as well for people who are already vulnerable. So thank you so much for that. Our next panelist is Floyd Marinescu. Floyd is the founder of UBI Works and the CEO and co-founder of C4 Media, which provides software development news and learning events serving 1.2 million people online through infoq.com and 8,000 attendees annually via QCon conferences in San Francisco, New York, London, Beijing, Shanghai, and Sao Paulo. Floyd is an angel investor in over a dozen startups and has built teams and businesses in the US, Canada, China, Brazil, and Europe. Floyd is a CEO advocate for universal basic income, and together with Paul Vallet, CEO of Pythian, organized 120 Canadian CEOs to endorse basic income in Canada in October of 2018. Floyd, thank you so much for making the time to be here today. I'm going to invite you to please share your thoughts at this time.
Great. Can I share my screen?
Absolutely.
Okay, I will do that now. I can't. Yeah, can I? Okay, one moment. So thanks everyone. Firstly, that says UBI behind me there. It's in green. It's a moss wall. Very passionate about basic income. And it says host disabled participant screen sharing. Sorry, I should have told you before.
Let's see here.
I'll keep trying.
Can give it a go now and see if that works.
Yes, it works. Great. So what I want to talk to you about today, it's a bit disorganized. One of my problems is I know so much about the subject, I often don't know where to start from. But I want to tell you a bit about why we have some of the challenges the other panelists mentioned, and also what we're doing next. Why are we having these challenges with youth in precarious positions is frankly captured by the picture on the right. It's that a lot of jobs just don't pay enough. And the reason they don't pay enough is not because of minimum wage. It's primarily because of technology that's affected people at all earnings levels. And I want to show you a few factors in this that I hope capture your imagination, which we will present in a much more polished manner soon with the big launch we're doing at UBI Works on July 14th, which I'll tell you about. One moment, make sure I still see my timer. There it is. One of the things that we need to understand is this concept, labor compensation as a share of GDP, as a share of income. So how much money is being made by people who work as a share of all the money being made? You can see it's going down. And the prime reasons it's been going down is technology and globalization, which is driven by technology. You couldn't make iPhones in China if you didn't have access to email and instant communications. You couldn't hire offshore teams as part of companies if it wasn't for the internet. And frankly, what happened with the pandemic now is going to lead to hyper-globalization, because it's very easy now when we're all on a Zoom screen to hire people in developing economies instead of locally. So every company in Canada now has learned how to do this. So that line going down is your future earnings as young people entering the workforce. It's why wages aren't going up. And it's been a big problem for not only for young people, also the middle class has not seen an increase in wages compared to cost of living in over 40 years. Another underlying trend, this is again, sorry, some draft article, we'll be publishing this soon, to understand, if you only understand two things that drive all the other things you've heard of the media, it's the previous graph and this one. This is called the Great Decoupling. Before around 1973, United States, wages, real median hourly wages paid to people used to go together with productivity, moving for decades on the same path. And then afterwards, at the big recession we had in 1973, they diverged. And you can see that productivity went up while wages stayed flat. Now, what was true around 1973? Well, just several years before that was the invention of computing and robotics, and they were entering into mainstream workforce. And what we've seen is that for every single recession we've had, companies that automate to survive. And that happened to my dad and uncle lost their jobs in Ontario's automotive manufacturing sector after the 2002 crisis, when companies had to automate to survive and be competitive with China. And 6 times more jobs were lost to automation than trade. So the graph on the right is the Canadian one. We're going to clean that up. But the big takeaway point here is that while productivity grew 52% in Canada between like many decades, hourly earnings for workers basically didn't grow. And the majority of that value went to shareholders, because that's what this graph of labor compensation means. When this goes down, capital income goes up, meaning money that goes to people who invest in companies and their CEOs. So that's why everything is happening. And it's important to understand that this is a systemic problem. It's not something that can be solved with a regulation. It needs a systemic solution. And the solution that we're proposing, that we'll be coming out with on July 14th, we call it Recovery EBI. And it looks something like this. We propose $500 for every Canadian adult. That's the blue line here, $500 a month, sorry. That's $6,000 a year. And on top of that, we build what's called a guaranteed minimum income to raise the red part up to $24,000 for people earning zero, to help them enter the middle class, to help them escape poverty, to streamline the system. And it's important to know that what you call basic income actually means two different things. It means a guaranteed minimum income, which is the red part. People also use it to describe a UBI, as Andrew Yang said, which is the blue part. It's the same for everyone. And they solve different problems. A guaranteed minimum income addresses poverty. It restores pathways into the middle class. It makes sure that lower income workers have a livable salary and don't need to do 3 jobs. But UBI recognizes that technology is cheaper than workers. It's taking a greater share of the value being created in our society at the expense of workers' wage growth. And only UBI can address this by giving everyone a slice of the value technology is creating, effectively making us owners in our economy. So we think we need both. A UBI on its own would not feasibly be able to be high enough to end poverty. But a guaranteed minimum income would also not be a systemic solution to reverse the way the economic pie is being split between working people and shareholders. You need both. Or you need a UBI that's big enough to also end poverty, which would be inconceivable in terms of the tax reform that it needs. So what we're doing is we're launching this campaign. We call it Recovery UBI. We're going to explain that it's a raise for working people. And why are we using this language and not talking about the challenges of poverty? It's unfortunate, but research has been shown that for a major social reform to pass, you basically need to convince the middle class that their future is better served with a policy that helps people who are also in poverty, versus if you convince them their future will be better served by policies that help upper income earners. So, for example, when people argue that tax cuts are good for economic growth and good for the middle class, that's a policy that favors higher income earners. And middle class people are like, all right, I'm going to vote for that. But now we have a chance to convince middle class people who are losing out due to technology that a basic income helps them. Well, it also helps people in poverty. So the arguments we use are how this will systemically impact everyone who works. And we know it'll solve poverty too. We just don't talk about it because we don't think middle class voters will be motivated by that. And that's a very unfortunate thing about electoral politics. So we're going to come out with this launch. We're going to show that the net cost of our program is $206 billion, but look, there's like 3 times more ways to pay for it. And we've actually collected all these tax reforms in a spreadsheet in a big document we're going to publish. And we're going to have a petition, and the petition will email. This is the draft of the petition page. You can come here and email your MP, Chrysler Freeland, Morneau, Trudeau, and we're going to package all this content I just showed you in a very nice way, very clean way to help you advocate for what you need and want. And we're going to frame it as a raise for working people, knowing that it also solves poverty, but not directly talking about that. Obviously mentioning it because it's very important. But we're mainly concerned with getting this on the election agenda, and whatever language will help that is what we're going to do. If you want to help out, sign up on ubiworks.ca, join the Facebook group, UBI Workers, off the UBI Works Facebook page. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Floyd. Yeah, those are some awesome resources. That brings up a really good point too about different kinds of basic income, which I think will definitely come up in the Q&A later as well. Perfect. There's our slides. Awesome. Our fourth speaker is going to be Maggie Pham. Maggie is an artist and entrepreneur based in Toronto, Canada. Born in Hong Kong and raised in Toronto, she ventured into Montreal 10 years ago, and since then has been an avid researcher on capitalism, a community friend, and world traveler. Maggie is always happy to discuss the mechanisms of society to further the discussion of evolution when it comes to underserved and marginalized communities. Currently, she's in Toronto working on her upcoming extended play record, as well as helping her community make sense of the difficult history that we are presently going through. Maggie, thank you so much for being here. Please share any opening remarks at this time.
Hey, thank you so much for inviting me on this panel. I'm really nervous right now because for a really long time, artists like myself aren't invited into these conversations because we are, there's a lot of like sabotaging beliefs such as, sorry about the ice cream truck. There's just a lot of, just give me a second. So I'm sorry. So I personally think that BI is a necessary step for this transition into technological automation. So I agree with Floyd. The job loss that comes with that, the racial reparations that is necessary to bring up the poverty line, or at least like the group of impoverished people and marginalized people. I myself am an immigrant, and I know that a lot of my peers are still in poverty because there isn't access to affordable healthcare that is not oppressive. or not, that's not dismissive. So when you make the research on the racial inequities when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to education, when it comes to job hiring, when it comes to all of that, I find that there's just a lot of discrimination. There isn't a lot of empathy. This is what carceral capitalism allows us to believe, and coupled with a cultural hegemony where we essentially just obsess over celebrity culture and their luxuries and how hard they work and whatever, and at the expense of our own mental health. We don't really have an opportunity to connect with our own humanity. So therefore we allow ourselves to dehumanize other people. And that in itself creates a lot of marginalization, creates a lot of unfairness, a lot of inequity. Myself, I struggle with my own mental health issues where my mother, actually, she grew up through the Vietnam War. And so when you look at the research behind epigenetics, you see that these types of traumas pass on these PTSD stuff. Poverty also is a precursor for a lot of crime, for a lot of mental health issues as well. So if BI isn't like, doesn't come with the necessary education that comes with it, because you see, and I agree with Faye before, when there was a settlement for Indigenous people because of the residential school, sorry, like because of that, they didn't come with, that settlement did not come with the type of therapy care, they didn't come with education, you know, and at that point, like, these people Indigenous people are just traumatized and they don't trust the education system, right? So when you don't have that empathy level, you don't have that support system to support somebody's health in general, it's really hard to get out of poverty because it is a cyclical thing. So, and then when you get into research about substance abuse and drug use, it's really the underlying cause of all of those is just a lack of connection. So what I really like and appreciate about this time in general with social media is that there's more awareness. So I have a lot of hope for our younger generations. My whole thing is just continue having the conversations with your inner circles, because that's all you really have. You don't have to be famous, you don't have to, but just keep having the conversation. And I think my time is up, and I'm so sorry, I got so nervous. And anyway, thank you so much.
That was perfect, Maggie. Thank you so much. And thank you for opening up a bit about your own personal experience. We really appreciate that. It's definitely crucial to mention the intersections of factors like housing accessibility and education, and newcomers to the country when considering basic income. So thank you for bringing those up. I want to mention again on that please do keep your questions coming in the chat box. It should be at the bottom of your screen there. Yeah, we have a lot of great content. So please do ask any questions you have for our panelists. I want to mention as well that our next panelist, Paul Taylor, does need to leave us at 1, so we will be prioritizing any questions for him first. With that, last but certainly not least, we have Paul Taylor. Paul is an anti-poverty activist and the executive director of FoodShare Toronto, one of Canada's largest food justice organizations. Food, says Paul, is a fundamental human right. Growing up in poverty has inspired his deep commitment to fighting for a more just society. Paul, thank you so much for making time to share your experiences with us today. And I'd like to give you the floor to share any opening remarks you have.
Excellent. Thanks so much for having me. I've already learned so much from listening to the speakers before me, so I feel like it's been a really nourishing experience. As you mentioned, I'm the executive director at an organization called FoodShare. FoodShare Toronto has been around since 1985, and the bulk of what we do is we work alongside community to develop community-based food interventions that respond to food insecurity. So there are things that range from community-led affordable produce markets, to community-led agriculture projects, so urban farms, and things like that. But we're also interested in advocating for systems change because we feel that we don't want to see people needing to access charity, and recognize that food in this country has largely been positioned as a response to things like poverty and food insecurity, and that's doing a disservice to the movement. So FoodShare talks a fair bit about income-based interventions like the UBI. So I'm going to first tell you about a little bit of research that we did to help set the context. You know, I've been at FoodShare for 3 years, and when I first started, I spent some time visiting many of the initiatives that we run, and I noticed that predominantly they were Black folks that were accessing a lot of the services that we were offering alongside community. So we decided to partner with Proof out of the University of Toronto to get a better sense of what was happening in this country around food insecurity when it comes to Black folks in comparison to white folks. And what we learned, first of all, is that research like this had never been done, and it was pretty alarming. First thing we learned was that Black folks are 3.5 times more likely to live in a food insecure household than white folks. We learned that 12% of white children live in food insecure households, while 36% of Black children lived in food insecure households. There's just a couple other pieces about this research that I want to share. Home ownership typically acts, when someone owns a home, they're less likely to be food insecure. What we found, and that was part of what the food movement has been saying about home ownership, but what we found in this research is that is indeed not the case for Black folks. Actually, the level of Black folks in this country that experience food insecurity is similar by 0.2% off from white renters. So I highlight some of those pieces before I talk about universal basic income, because I think it's really important to know, to orient our thinking in the understanding that, you know, Black, Indigenous folks especially, and other POC, but in particular Black and Indigenous folks, are disproportionately reflected in stats around poverty and food insecurity. So any type of income-based interventions has to work for those folks. So I'm going to maybe argue for a few things that need to come alongside an income floor. So things like race-based data on food insecurity and poverty, so that we can actually look at the impact these interventions are having on groups that we recognize are most vulnerable. I also think that conversations around developing an income floor, you know, as I reflect on and talk to folks about where that comes from, one of the things I realize is it's a go-forward approach. And a go-forward approach comes with some privilege. The privilege to be able to think, okay, this is what we're going to do next. But we have to also ground ourselves in the history and the continued loss of land, loss of economic opportunity, the health impacts for particularly Black and Indigenous communities. So I think we need to also talk about restitution by way of reparations or things like that before we can also talk about moving forward or alongside a go-forward plan. So I think there's no question that an income floor has some significant potential around advancing SDGs, but I think you know, it can't reduce or eliminate poverty on its own. So in my mind, it needs to come with a guarantee of public services. We can set an income floor at a level, but then housing continues to be unaffordable. The next cost for most families is childcare that continues to be unaffordable. So I actually think we need to take sometimes a step back and say, we live in one of the richest countries in the world, and we need to think about what quality of life should we all be able to expect. So I think, yes, if we use that frame, yes, an income floor is absolutely important and critical tool there, but also is a guarantee of public services. So things like affordable housing, childcare, pharmacare, access to affordable food and affordable utilities, as well as things like free tuition and educational materials. And continuing to make sure that something like developing an income floor doesn't allow employers to pay crappy wages, so that we also continue the fight around increasing minimum wages. So that's kind of where some of my thinking has been around this, that's been informed by some of the research that we've done, some of my lived experience, but also, you know, the expectation that we live in one of the richest countries in the world. We should be leading in terms of the quality of life that people should expect. Look at that, I think I did it in 4 minutes. Awesome.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, you brought up so many great intersections of basic income that are also crucial when we consider this and how it would be implemented. So thank you so much for that. Thank you to all of our panelists for making the time to share such valuable insights and your experiences with us. I see lots of really excellent questions in our chat box. So I'm going to invite Safa to get our Q&A portion started.
Thank you, Johanna, and thank you to all our panelists. We have an array of questions, but I'm going to prioritize questions for Paul and Floyd, who both have to leave us at 1 o'clock. So Paul, I'm going to begin with you. You know, you mentioned the
I know I said something.
Political will to take actions to actually implement a lot of these policy ideas. So when it comes to really doing more to shore up political will, what do you think more can be done?
I think one of the previous speakers really crystallized that for me. When we talk about the middle class bias that exists in public policy, that's actually because of the bias that exists in who can access who can become a politician in this country, because of course they're reinforcing their own values and lived experience. So I think one of the first things we can do is make sure we're pushing back and helping elect the type of folks that are racialized, are Black, Indigenous, folks of color with lived experience of poverty and food insecurity, so that issues of poverty are actually on the table and really and considered electorally. So I would say that's one of the pieces, but I also think we have so much power as people, you know, so I think we can continue to be out on the streets. We can continue to be demonstrating that we expect more and that we know better is possible.
Wonderful, thank you. And then a second follow-up question for you from our audience is, do you have any tips for challenging narratives around BI that explicitly exclude BIPOC and their experiences, including poverty experiences? So yes, that was the question.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I talk to my colleagues about often is about things like the curb theory. You know, when we work to make sidewalks more accessible for people with disabilities, and we prioritize making sure that the sidewalks are accessible for people with disabilities, we find then that, you know, folks with strollers, folks it helps a whole bunch of other folks along the way. So we've got to prioritize the folks that we know, and now we have data that supports this, that are the most vulnerable to issues of poverty and food insecurity and the like. So that has to be a part of the conversation. I think we should reject interventions that don't have a gender, a race analysis to them at all.
Absolutely, thank you so much. So I'm going to go on with some questions for Floyd, and then if we have time, I'll come back to Paul before 1 o'clock. So for Floyd, we have a question from the audience that says, 1 second, it says, what are ways to convince relatives in the technology area to use their privilege to make positive impacts, and what are ways to motivate them to do so?
Certainly faced that issue with my parents. From an empathetic point of view, I think it's worth saying that we will have a much harder time earning a good salary, accumulating wealth, buying a house, getting married, having kids than they did. And it's just not fair. And it's not because of any one person's doing. It's because of the march of technology that's doing more work that we would otherwise do, where we are actually being all undervalued. I think that might help. It's a fairness argument. Why should it be easier for them than for us? Shouldn't a society make things easier for their next generations to get ahead in life? Improve equality of opportunity, not make it harder. And that's what's happening now. There's something else I also want to mention. I remember Andrew Yang was interviewed on I think it was a television network for people of color, and they were talking about reparations. And he said, it's important to note that a UBI disproportionately favors those who were on the losing end of our economic growth. It disproportionately favors people of the BIPOC background, because for people on lower incomes or who have less wealth, the actual size of the check is a much greater raise of their incomes than it is for, say, the 1%, for which it would be a 0.1% increase in income, but it would be a 30% increase in income for someone making $19,000 a year. So it's an important point that's just worth noting. You can argue for UBI in a progressive manner without necessarily using a lot of the narratives that people that we've been talking about in this call. And sometimes you do need to avoid some of those narratives depending on who you're talking to and who you're trying to sell this idea to.
Thank you so much. I have another question for Floyd from the audience, but I have a bit of trouble understanding it. So I'm going to read it out, but if you are the person who shared this, please feel free to turn on the mic to clarify it. And the question reads, what are ways for UBI and technology and cybersecurity and specifically individuals to work, and how can this knowledge be localized? Not only limited to refugees, immigrants, war children, asylum seekers, to be able not to be neglected longingly. So if the person who wrote this, if you'd like to maybe clarify, please feel free to turn on your mic.
Sure, yeah, sorry, I was kind of distracted. I was talking about how, like, UBI, you mentioned that technology is cheaper. So if we continue to, like, there's a conversation on AI where, artificial intelligence where, yeah, it might be beneficial, but for some areas we still need that human connection. And with cybersecurity being such a thing where governments are talking about, what's it called? Sorry. Like tracking people and other devices, what are ways that those individuals that usually get neglected in these conversations to be in that universal basic income while there's still a cybersecurity issue?
I'll answer a slightly different question that you touched on. UBI would actually be good for immigration because it would make Canada more of a beacon of hope around the world. And Canada already has a very dispassionate immigration system. And a lot of people would be attracted to come here. And people who have been seeking asylum and refugees, we have a very generous program on that. It could be more generous, of course. It would be granted to people upon getting permanent residency, not just to citizens, because we don't want to create a two-tier society. And that's actually a great thing. You know, immigration is what drives our economic growth. It's what drives our diversity. We should have more of it. I don't see any connection between cybersecurity and UBI. I don't understand what that would be. But I hope I addressed part of your question.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So now we'll just go back to a question for Paul. And the question reads, what are ways to localize the step back initiatives to restore while distancing at this time? So again, the person who wrote that, feel free to clarify the last part of the question by turning on your mic.
Yes, I may need some help with that question. But while that person is kind of considering jumping on to help clarify their question a little bit, you know, I just want to highlight again, I feel like it would be remiss not to, but, you know, although things like a basic income would have a disproportionate impact on BIPOC folks, I think it doesn't address the generations of health impacts and loss of opportunity that have led folks, BIPOC folks, to disproportionately exist in those the poverty and food insecurity statistics. So I think we actually need to, as a society, acknowledge that as well as we move forward. And I'm the kind of guy that likes to dream big. So there are other folks who might, I think we need all kinds of folks as part of this conversation. I might not get the big vision that I'm hoping for, but we also need other people who are advocating for different things so that The folks who make the decisions and feel like they're scaling back, they can say, okay, well, Paul, you didn't get everything, but we got these things. So I do value the diversity of opinions that come with advocacy in general and advocating for things like a basic income.
I just want to point something out. Basic income almost passed in 1968, United States. The reason it didn't pass is because 2 Democratic senators thought it wasn't generous enough. So we have to be careful to not try and add too many other issues to passing the single policy. And that's just a big concern, because when I talk to people, everybody wants to make it part of a bigger solution. Maybe it should, by all means. I believe in reparations, but it's just something I'm really concerned about, that we don't lose that chance again because people thought it wasn't generous enough, and then the attitude shifts and we move on to something else.
Mm-hmm. Similarly to reparations, and I think the moment that we're in for Black folks and for Indigenous folks. So I think, yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that.
Very important considerations to keep in mind. When it comes to BI as a policy tool, and this question can be for either of you and also Chloe and our other speakers, when it comes to thinking of BI as a policy tool and how implementing it might take away from the budget of some other policy tools that exist in the whole social service sector, what are your thoughts around balancing that? I know sometimes in our previous webinar discussions, that question was raised in terms of how would implementing this affect the other social services that exist within our system in Canada. So any thoughts around that?
I can start because I think that this is a really important question and it's a big one. And I think that, I mean, at least for myself and most of the folks that I know and sort of work with in the BI space, none of us are advocating for basic income at the expense of things like pharmacare, of things like childcare, of things like living wages. I think in my mind and the minds of many, those things necessarily have to go together. And I think that the framing of basic income and these other things as an either-or situation, especially in a country as rich as Canada, is a pretty pessimistic way to look at it when we should be demanding a lot more from our politicians in terms of our quality of life. I think in terms of, and this kind of went back to one of the questions, in terms of social assistance and specifically what basic income looks like in relation to social assistance, because that is sort of the one thing where I think it is generally accepted that basic income would replace, for instance, in Ontario Works and ODSP. And I can speak from my research where most of the folks that I was speaking with had moved from one of those programs onto basic income. I don't think any of them would have chosen to go back onto social assistance had they been able to stay on basic income, both because basic income was higher in terms of an amount, and the way that the Ontario pilot was designed actually gave an additional monthly top up to folks with disabilities, recognizing that the cost of living for those people is higher, which I think was a really important thing to do. But also the question of stigma and sort of the stigma that's attached to existing social assistance programs, and the need to be, especially as for people who are low income, for people who have disabilities, of having to go in month after month to a caseworker and demonstrate just how poor or just how disabled or just how in need of the money they really are, and sort of how basic income sort of breaks that link. So I think, long story short, feel confident that we should be able to ask for basic income and XYZ. But I think in my mind, at least, the one thing that basic income is replacing, I think especially in Ontario, we know that there are a lot of problems with our existing programs, and I don't have a particular issue with that being replaced, but maybe other people have other thoughts.
I've taken up a little bit of space, but can I add something?
Please.
So I agree, but I completely agree. I just want to share a little bit, one other line about the research that we did that speaks to how important it is to have a race lens for these types of interventions. So when we looked at people who were food insecure in this country, we also looked at where they got their income from. Most of those folks are working, but there's a chunk of people who actually receive social assistance. And what we found, which blew my hat off, was that white people in this country actually receive more on social, we didn't think that this would pop up. White people in this country receive more on social assistance than Black folks do. Why is that, you might ask? Welfare is pretty much an equation. Well, it also includes disability supports. So what that research is telling us is that white folks are more likely to be approved for disability, or if they are approved, when they are approved, they're more likely to be approved for more. So I think we must have income-based interventions, absolutely, but we also need to really make sure that there's race-based data that we're capturing, so we're not leaving folks who are already vulnerable behind. But I agree with everything that is.
Wonderful. Unless Floyd had something to add, I'm conscious of the time.
I actually have something to add, if that's okay.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, so I agree with what Chloe and Paul would say, that there is definitely, you know, a conversation that needs to be had about racial lens and not at the expense of other social services as well. Yeah, like there has to be an acknowledgement. There has to be an understanding that that everybody has a cognitive bias when it comes to growing in this society, and that we really have to remove stigma. One of the things that I did see in the last couple of months before we got into quarantine was Ontario just decided to make mental health care more affordable / free. I believe in that. And then there is also more elementary education and secondary education revolving around financial education, which is and financial competence, which will be very, very beneficial for our younger generations. Because when I was growing up, we didn't have that, you know, and I had to educate myself on how to handle money, how to use it, how to earn it, and basically all that. And another thing was that I also think that in our education system, we have to have more conversations or education revolving around understanding each other, learning how to have disagreements in a safe space, and creating that. Because for a really, really, really long time, we just allowed all these discriminations to continue on without having the conversation. It was always shut down if somebody wanted to talk about it, or it was always dismissed, and there would be arguments. And the reason why we're at this point now in society is that we are pushing to have the difficult conversation, and we need more education to develop those skill sets and having, you know, the difficult conversation about disagreements. And I think at least with those skill sets in mind, that can really generate a lot of positivity and a lot of change, sweeping changes, and not just like tiny little incremental changes. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts. I'm conscious of the time, so it's 1 o'clock now. So thank you so much to our panelists, Paul and Floyd, who have to leave now. And thank you for your time.
So we will go ahead and get our conversation cafe started and split into some smaller discussion groups. So we're going to stay in those breakout rooms for about 10 minutes before returning to the main session to wrap up. If you're not able to stay with us for those few minutes, no problem at all. Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. And if you're able to stay with us for a while longer, you'll be placed into a breakout room momentarily. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you all had some fruitful breakout sessions. Mine was great, so I'm hoping that yours was too. Before we let you go, do we have time to sort of share a bit about what people discussed? Is that okay? Yeah, okay. Does anyone want to share anything about what they discussed in their breakout room? Okay, I will get things started and then people can jump in if they feel comfortable. Ours was really great. We focused a lot on sort of technology, and how that's sort of a whole component that my group didn't think much about prior to hearing Floyd sort of dive in about it today. So that was really informative, and sort of a whole other factor that we have to consider and think really critically about when considering an implementation of BI as well. I also just want to call on Faye to see if she wants to mention anything or add any notes from today.
Sure. We talked, I guess the starting point was that we had conversations on the panel about individuals, but didn't spend enough time on the structural or systemic inequalities that puts us in those situations. And we talked about an economic argument for the basic income, and I shared from my perspective as an Indigenous person that they do invest an awful lot in the apprehending of our children and the filling of the prisons with Indigenous women, and surely they can afford to divert some of those dollars to basic income so that people can be self-actualized and not end up in those situations. And we talked a bit about land acknowledgement and the irony of that, and talking about the poverty of Indigenous peoples and other peoples.
Absolutely, that is really great feedback, Faye. I really appreciate you saying that. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm not sure if anyone else would like to share before we sort of close things off for today. Okay. Before we let everyone go, we do just want to mention that we have a design thinking workshop coming up 2 weeks from today on July 16th. That will be led by Christina of the Youth Policy Hub. It'll be at noon again, and it'll be sort of a great way to finish off our series with sort of a capstone session. So you're more than welcome to join us for that. And lastly, please do connect with us online and stay connected. You can keep up with OCIC through Facebook, Twitter, their websites, and learn more about the Youth Policy Hub through the OCIC website as well. And you'll also receive a great list of resources from today that will have ways that you can stay involved and engaged and up to date on everything going on in sort of the basic income world. So thank you all so much again for joining us. It means a lot to our team that you made time in your week to be here. So stay safe, everyone. Thank you so much.